Sunday is going to be a fun race because for the first time this year, we go from emphasizing laps led to prioritizing them. And that's a pretty big difference for NASCAR DFS. And the reason we're doing that is because it is a longer race. We're out in Phoenix. It is a 750 horsepower package. It's a very different product than what we've seen the past 2 weeks. And it does force a recalibration of what we want to do for NASCAR DFS. What we're going to do today is break down strategies, break down lap leaders, break down which guys I think will lead laps on Sunday, and let you know my favorite drivers in each salary tier for the Instacart 500. Welcome on into the Heat Check Fantasy Podcast, powered by numberFire. That's right here on the FanDuel Podcast Network and numberFire.com. My name is Jim Sonis. I am a senior writer and analyst for numberFire.com, here to break down the Instacart 500 from a NASCAR DFS perspective out in Phoenix for this week. Lock is at 3:30 p.m. Eastern on Sunday. We're going to let you know all the big details you need to know to set your lineups. The lineup has already been set. The starting order has been set. So as you are listening along, feel free to pull up a player pool over on FanDuel.com. Fill in things as you see fit. Disagree with me, agree with me, whatever you want. You can fill out lineups as we go here for today. Before we do that, though, quick reminder, we got a lot of good stuff popping here on the numberFire Daily Fantasy Podcast feed. So make sure you are subscribed to get all that goodness into your podcast feed as it goes up. We have a UFC podcast for tomorrow. Smaller card, not a big card, but Austin Swaim does like a lot of things he sees there. So you can check that out on the numberFire Daily Fantasy Podcast feed right now. Of course, we have Tom Vecchio doing NBA and NHL DFS every weekday. And Brandon Gadula and I are doing PGA DFS every Tuesday to get you set for that week's golf event. Also, a fun thing coming up next week for the NCAA tournament. We're going to have myself, Dr. Ed Feng, Aaron Dolan, and Bennett Corcoran breaking down the NCAA tournament, breaking down your brackets, letting you know who you want to target, some teams you may want to fade based on what the public is doing. We'll be recording that live on the FanDuel YouTube, Twitch, Facebook, and Periscope pages on Monday night, 6 p.m. Eastern. It will go here in the numberFire Daily Fantasy Podcast feed immediately after that. So if you are subscribed here, you will get it right in your podcast feed. So just make your life a whole lot easier. Make sure you're subscribed. And if you like what you hear, leave us a rating and review because that does help us out a ton. Speaking of college basketball, with conference tournaments cooking up this weekend, there is no better place to bet on college basketball than on FanDuel Sportsbook. Right now, FanDuel is offering college basketball parlay insurance. Place a 5+ leg parlay on college basketball. If you hit all the legs except for one, get up to $25 back in site credits. Make your parlays today and bet on the FanDuel Sportsbook. Must be 21 plus and present in Colorado, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Virginia, or West Virginia. Refund issued as a non-withdrawable site credit that expires in 14 days. Restrictions apply. See full terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In Colorado, call 1-800-522-4700. In Iowa, call 1-800-BETS-OFF. In Indiana, call 1-800-9-WITH-IT. For confidential help in Michigan, call 1-800-270-7117. In Tennessee, call the Red Line, 1-800-889-9789. Or in West Virginia, visit 1-800-GAMBLER.net. Let's dive into the track breakdown for this week out in Phoenix. And as mentioned, we need to prioritize laps led in Phoenix this weekend. That's because it is the longest race we've had so far this year, 312 laps, which leads to 31.2 FanDuel points being available for laps led, which is an increase of almost 5 points from last week. And that may not seem like a lot, but it really is. It's also a situation where the starting order is becoming more efficient. The passing is not as easy as it has been the past couple of weeks, and all of those factors funnel us towards targeting drivers starting towards the front part of the pack. I think the blueprint for this week needs to be having at least 2 lap leaders in every lineup. There were 2 races in Phoenix last year. Looking at the optimal lineups from those races, one of them had 220 laps led across the 5 drivers inside the perfect lineup. 3 drivers there led at least 60 laps, so there were 3 lap leaders in that one. And 2 others, the other race had 2 drivers who led at least 125 laps. There were 282 laps led total. So laps led were a focal point for the perfect lineup in both Phoenix races last year. But the Phoenix races aren't necessarily our best indicators because the first one had qualifying. We don't have qualifying this week. It's set by an algorithm instead. They won't have that this week. The second one was a championship race. And That was the first time we had the championship race in Phoenix, but it did play out similar to the championship races in Homestead, where the top 4 contenders got a lot of leeway, dominated the race, and you kind of knew that they were going to win and run out front. So not necessarily the best analog to look at the 2 Phoenix races. But even when we expand to other similar races on similar tracks, we get the exact same vibe. The perfect lineup for the playoff race in Richmond, 2 drivers who started inside the top 10, both led at least 55 laps. Very much in line with our formula here for Phoenix. The New Hampshire race had 2 drivers inside the top 10 who led 90 or more laps. So if we have 4 races where they were kind of similar, where they had a short flat track, good number of laps, at least 300 laps total in the race, and starting order was set by, somewhat similar mechanisms, all 4 of them had at least 2 drivers who led 55 or more laps, and one of them had 3. So to me, this says we need to have at least 2 lap leaders in each lineup. And I think there is some wiggle room for 3, depending on the way you see the race playing out, depending on your view of the middle tier. We do have to navigate around the salary cap here. So ideally you're jamming in 5 lap leaders, but you can't really do that realistically. So there are ways to get around that. The first one is that mid-range plays can help us out a lot. They can lead laps at this track. If you find a mid-range driver with the speed to run up front and lead laps, they will have a lot of value for this race. That's always true, but I think that it's even more true here where laps led are so much of a priority. Second, we can absolutely justify using drivers with salaries in the 6,000 range this week. It's a track where equipment, it matters at the front end, but there is a larger pool of drivers who can get a top 10. There may not be a larger pool of drivers who can win, but there's a larger pool of drivers who can get a top 10, so more drivers can realistically compete. All 4 perfect lineups from last year in these similar races had at least 1 driver with a salary of $7,000 or lower. One of them had 2. So get at least 2 lap leaders per lineup. 3 is in play, and you can potentially get some lower salary guys to squeeze in there. For the value plays there, we can still get place differential. The average starting slot for drivers in perfect lineups, so the salary below $8,000 was 22.3. For those below $9,000, it was 21.4. And I do think that place differential will be available for this weekend. If you look at my model for this week, 4 of the top 15 drivers in that model are starting 20th or lower. And they're not drivers with prohibitive salaries. It does mean you're banking on guys to bounce back from slow starts, or else they would not be starting further back. But that's fine for me because this is the first time this year we've had an oval race using the 750 horsepower package. It's a very different race from the past 2 weeks, and it's different from any race we've had so far this year. So struggling in those races earlier this year doesn't mean you will struggle here. So if you're looking for signals of who is going to do well this weekend, I go back to what guys did last year on short, flat tracks. The tracks I put in that bucket are Phoenix, Richmond, New Hampshire, and Martinsville. Martinsville, I would say, is the least indicative of those 4, but it is better than looking at Dover or Bristol in this same package. So to me, I think the key ones are Phoenix, Richmond, New Hampshire, and it helps that our most recent race on an oval in this package was exactly at Phoenix. So the championship race does give us some pretty good keys. So to recap here, I want 2 lap leaders at least per lineup, and they're probably going to start towards the front of the field because, it can take a bit to work your way through traffic and stuff like that. And I think you can even justify jamming in a 3rd driver as well if you can find a way to fit it. For me, from a starting position perspective, I don't care if they're both in the front row. Actually in both Phoenix races last year, 2 drivers in the front row were in the perfect lineup. I could be wrong there, but there were a couple of races last year at similar races where both drivers starting first and second were in the perfect lineup. So I don't care where they start. I'd like them to be towards the front. If they have them in the front row, cool. I'm totally okay with that. The value in the mid-range drivers goes up. If you think they can lead laps here, you want to target place differential guys for your value plays, and I think you should be willing to drivers in the 6,000 range if it gets you additional upside elsewhere. I'll add a caveat here that the 6,000 range this week is not the best, but we'll talk about strategies to navigate around that once we get to that section in the tier-by-tier breakdown. Speaking of which, let's start that off now with the elite tier based on the salaries over at FanDuel.com. That is Kevin Harvick at $14,000 through Joey Logano at $12,000. And my favorite guys here are the two Penske drivers. That's Brad Keselowski and Joey Logano. Keselowski starting on the pole, Logano starting 9th. The big reason to love those two guys specifically is what they did on short, flat tracks last year. It's a 6-race sample, which means that if we combine those two drivers, they ran 12 races on these tracks. They had 3 wins compared to just 1 finish outside the top 4. And the 1 finish that was outside the top 4 was actually Keselowski in the first Phoenix race. In that race, he spun early on, went back in the pack, still worked his way forward, led 82 laps, and won the second stage. He had some late cautions that worked against him and pushed him outside the top 4, but they were tough to beat on this track type last year. And I think they're both under-salaried for this week. Keselowski, $12,500, Logano, $12,000. Keselowski can lead laps early while Logano works his way forward. So those two will be paired together in a good number of my lineups, and they're my favorite 2 drivers for this race on Sunday. The tough guy in this tier, for me at least, is Kevin Harvick. He is $14,000 and starting 18th. So there's place differential upside there. But as mentioned before, we need laps led. And it is tougher to get them from back there. And he wasn't as good on these tracks last year as Keselowski and Logano were. If you use Harvick at $14,000, you at the very least need to pair him with a driver closer to the front who can lead laps while Harvick works his way forward. So I'm going to use Harvick because place differential does still count here, but I think the win odds are, I think the odds are high that I wind up being underweight on Harvick relative to the field. He is overvalued in the win odds market based on my win simulations. I think people will be chasing the place differential, so realistically, I'll probably be underweight on Harvick, but I still would like to use him. So my ranking this year is Keselowski 1, Logano 2, Chase Elliott 3 because he won 2 of the other races on this tracks like this last year, so they did win Phoenix too. So Elliott's number 3 for me. Harvick will be 4, Denny Hamlin 5. I'm lower on Hamlin because Joe Gibbs Racing was not as good on these tracks last year. I think they could get better this year because I think they realized how far behind they were on the high horsepower package. But for right now, I'm okay being a little bit lower and going with the Penske and the Hendrick cars for the most part. The second tier on FanDuel is Kyle Busch at $11,700 through William Byron at $10,000. And these guys are all starting inside the top 10. So they could be potential lap leaders, and also means I can just view them and rank them how I feel about them potentially winning this race. My favorite guy in this tier, shocker, will be the other Penske car in Ryan Blaney. He is starting 8th. He's $10,500, and he was not as good as Logano and Keselowski on these tracks last year, but he does have a top 6 average running position in 3 of the past 4 Phoenix races, so he's been good at this track, and he's one of the mid-range guys who could lead laps. So I think that Blaney is the top option in this tier. Second for me will be Kyle Larson. He was awesome in Phoenix when he was with Chip Ganassi Racing. He didn't lead a lot of laps. He didn't win, but he has finished 6th or better in each of the past 4 races he has had on this track type. He's on the front row with Keselowski, so he has easy access to laps led, and his equipment will be really good. So Larson, not quite as high as Blaney for me, but pretty easily number 2. I'd rank Kyle Busch and Martin Truex Jr. ahead of William Byron, but I do want to say that Byron's not totally off the map. He is $10,000 and starting 10th. He actually has 8.3% win odds in my simulations, which is weirdly right on par with Kyle Busch. Now, Byron, not elite in Phoenix, but he hasn't been bad. He was actually top 10 in both races last year, and he's shown upside elsewhere on tracks like this. Like Martinsville, he's been good at before. So I think Byron actually has more upside than you would think. And the salary at $10,000 is pretty forgiving. So this tier to me is Blaney 1, Larson 2, Truex 3, Kyle Busch 4, and Byron 5. But all these guys are at least options, and Blaney and Larson will be borderline core plays for me because their salaries are so good, given that they could win this race and do have a decent amount of lap sled potential as well. The mid-range on FanDuel is Kurt Busch at $9,500 through Tyler Reddick at $7,500, and this is an area where we can get some place differential options. We've got Alex Bowman, Eric Almirola, and Matt DiBenedetto all inside the top 15 in my model and starting 20th or lower. Bowman is starting 21st at $9,000. The Hendrick cars were really good here last year, as evidenced by Chase Elliott winning the championship. Bowman had top 10 runs in Richmond and in both Martinsville races, so I like him quite a bit. I like Bowman a decent amount. If you want a more balanced lineup, I think that Bowman is a clear standout there. DiBenedetto's with Penske, so obviously he was good on this track type. He had 4 top 10 finishes, 3 top 10 average running positions on the short flat tracks last year. He's starting 20th. He had a really good run last week before they had a weird issue on their pit stop, which forced him to run like 90 laps on a really old tire. He's starting 20th, $7,700. That's super forgiving. So I think that DiBenedetto, again, back in the core this week, what could go wrong? Almirola has had a really brutal start to the year, so that's why he's starting back in 32nd. He's $8,000, but he was pretty decent on this track type last year in this package. If we look broadly at the 750 horsepower package, 6 top 10s in 10 races for Almirola. I am fine buying into a bounce back here, especially with this being so different from the tracks where he has struggled to start the year. I would say, though, that the start for Stewart-Haas Racing is broadly pretty concerning, but regardless, I'll still use Almirola because why not? I'm going to rank these guys: Almirola 1, Bowman 2, DiBenedetto 3, but all 3 of those guys will be fixtures for me. Kurt Busch, sneaky, kind of fun, starting 12th, $9,500. I think that, he shows some value in the win odds in my simulations, so I don't mind Busch. Tyler Reddick, starting 23rd, $7,500. I can get behind that too, just not quite as high on him as I am on guys Almirola, Bowman, DiBenedetto, who had better success on tracks like this last year. The value plays on FanDuel are Cole Custer at $7,300. They're Ryan Newman at $5,500. And I think Custer is in a really good spot for this week. He is $7,300, starting 24th. And his best track type last year was the short flat tracks because his aggregate average running position was a full position better than his second best track type. That does include the first Phoenix race, finished 9th there. He was also top 10 in New Hampshire. So if we're looking at the lowest salary driver about whom I feel really good this week, that's Custer. So to me, I think that ups the value in Keselowski and Logano, who don't have super high salaries. If I go with them as my studs, having Custer as my floor driver is pretty realistic and can allow me to get to DiBenedetto, Almirola, Bowman. I feel pretty good about that type of construction for this week. So Custer is a guy I will have a lot of on Sunday. The rest of this tier has a lot of flaws. Austin Dillon led some laps in Richmond, but in general was pretty underwhelming on this track type. Ryan Newman, not a high upside guy. Eric Jones didn't run well on these tracks last year and now has worse equipment. Bubba Wallace did not run well here, but his equipment is a lot better now than it was previously. Chase Briscoe, underwhelming on these tracks in the Xfinity Series. So I would say in this value range, Cole Custer is in a tier of his own. My model would rank Austin Dillon second, so I suppose I'll just go with that. I'd be willing to take some swipes at Bubba Wallace, starting 25th and better equipment. Might be enough to make him interesting. But it's not a great range. I want Custer to be, I want to be at Custer and higher when possible from a salary floor perspective. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that that's the best way to give my lineup the best floor without sacrificing upside. So that's probably the way I'll play things a lot this week. Even though I did say that punting is pretty viable here, it just happens to be the guys, specifically this year, not quite as appealing. The punting tier is guys at $5,000 on down, and it's pretty similar to the range above this, where I'm willing to take some swipes, but there's nobody here I really want to commit to. My favorite option is Ross Chastain. He is $5,000 starting 22nd. He did run pretty well in the short flat tracks in the Xfinity Series last year. Actually, was more impressive than Briscoe to me. So I don't love it, but I can live with it. Like if I want to jam in Harvick and still get some lap leaders, I can get behind that for sure. Chris Buescher is pretty respectable at $4,500. He's had a good start to the year, and last year in this package was underwhelming, but he was pretty good at places, on the shorter flat tracks with JTG Doherty racing back in the past. So Chastain and Buescher are fine. I just don't want to go too crazy with anyone down here. So I think that the way I'll likely approach this is using more of a rotational approach down here so as to keep my exposure lower to each individual driver. Like I'll have some Chastain, have some Buescher, have some Bubba, but my core will revolve around the guys in the 7,000 and 8,000 range. I will dip down here to get more exposure to guys like Blaney, Larson, Logano, while still getting other studs. So my baseline approach will be to keep my floor at being a Custer and higher. But when I want to dip down, jam in more upside, I will kind of rotate through and not commit to any one driver down here. Chastain, Buescher, Bubba, guys like that would be the ones I turn to. Austin Dillon to an extent as well. Finishing up here with my picks to win for this week, what I did is just sorted by the win odds in my simulations, looked at the guy who was highest above $10,000 and the guy who was highest below $10,000. And the guy above, no shocker, given the way I was talking about him before, it's Brad Keselowski. He's 7-1 to win at FanDuel Sportsbook. I think that is an advantageous number. I do like him a lot for there. My betting guide for this week is up on numberFire.com right now. Keselowski is featured in there. I think he makes a lot of sense. I like Keselowski as my win pick above $10,000. For the guys below it, the driver with the highest win odds and the salary below $10,000 is Kurt Busch, $9,500. He is 25-1 to win, starting in 12th, and I think that that's why there is value in using him. I do like Bowman more. Bowman, lower win odds in my simulation, but better team, starting deeper in the pack. So for DFS, I think he makes more sense. If I were betting one, though, I'd go with Busch over Bowman for this week. So win picks this week, Keselowski and Kurt Busch. I don't think I've picked either yet this year. So changing things up a bit with the new track type on the menu. That is all that we have for today here on the NASCAR DFS Heat Check. But do not forget to subscribe to the numberFire Daily Fantasy Podcast feed for NHL, NBA, PGA, UFC, and NASCAR podcasts going up each and every day here on the numberFire Daily Fantasy Podcast feed, and the bracket breakdown coming up on Monday with myself, Dr. Ed Feng, Aaron Dolan, and Bennett Corcoran. It's also live on the FanDuel YouTube page, 6 p.m. Eastern. So subscribe there, subscribe to the numberFire Daily Fantasy Podcast feed, and leave us a rating and review if you like what you hear or if you win some money, because that does help us out quite a bit. Big thank you to Calvin Theobald, our video producer, for running the video side of things here today. Thank you, Cal, as always. If you have questions for me, I am on Twitter at JimSannes, JimSannes. You can also follow the FanDuel Podcast Network at FanDuel Podcast. Thank you to everyone for tuning in for today. Good luck to you with your NASCAR DFS lineups and your bets. We'll talk to you once again next week for Atlanta. This has been the Heat Check Fantasy Podcast powered by numberFire.